I know Tim now for 10, 11 years now since he came to ETH in 2010, but he did his training in England where he got his bachelor, master, and finally his PhD. And then he went for a postdoc, actually two postdocs, one in Delft and one in Oslo, before he joined the geoscience group, geochemical science group at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And that's where he made major discoveries. Uh, I remember Tim from the time there, but I had no idea who he was at the time and that we would ever meet again. And this was, you might not know this, Tim, but this was a seminar given by Katharina Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what it was about? It was about how microbes eat ancient carbon. Okay? So that's something that comes up now again, but I remember that I was in the microbial diversity course at the time. Now in 2010, Tim came to ETH. He's now a full professor here. And our crossroads are more or less the teaching. We had an opportunity to establish a biogeoscience field trip and lab course together and developed also a geobiology course. Now his major interests are carbon cycling in any position from the source to the sink and back to the becoming a source again. And that's what we will hear today. Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Kurt. Yeah, so thanks for the invitation to present and also to sort of host these two lectures today and two that will come along next week. And so we are charged with focusing on sedimentary aspects. So marine sedimentary aspects, of course, with relevance to the Benguela Upwelling region. But as you'll see from my presentation, I will stray further afield in order to try and make some key points. So the subtitle is Sedimentation and Carbon Accumulation Due to Leaky Biogeochemical Pumps and Cycles. This is Kurt's subtitle, but I think it does capture much of what you will hear about today and next week. I want to start with a figure that is from a very nice review paper by Jack Middleberg. And to me, this is a very nice figure because it shows the different ways that you can think about marine sediments and their role in different aspects of biogeochemical cycles, but also other aspects with connected to ecosystems, etc. So it sort of is looking at sediments through a different set of lenses, if you like. So if you are a paleoceanographer trying to reconstruct, for instance, past ocean conditions on the Namibian margin, then essentially you're looking at the sediments and early diagenetic processes as a filter which can distort and modify the signal that you're trying to read and use to reconstruct what was happening back in the water column. So in this regard, the sedimentary processes are sort of a filter and a distortion set of processes which we have to account for. If you're a biogeochemist, we're mostly interested in fluxes of elements and nutrients. And so here we're looking at sediments as sort of an interface between the water column and the deep subsurface, where particularly microbes are playing a key role in transforming different biochemicals into smaller products, which then are recycled back to the water column, but also, again, that this is a process by which organic matter can be transformed and ultimately buried in the sediments. If you are an organic geochemist, you're often very much focused on the actual organic compounds themselves and how they are changing as you go through from the water column through to what is ultimately preserved. So understanding transformations and selective preservation of different compounds. And last of all, if you are an ecologist, are also involved in looking at the oceans as a resource, so for fisheries, then obviously you're interested in the sediment as a habitat or a substrate for life, and with these various other components fueling life of different forms. So there are these different ways you can look at the seafloor, and we'll try and capture some of those today and next week, but I'll also sort of add one in my presentation. So today we have two presentations, one by myself, looking at largely at carbon residing within marine sediments as a carbon stock, and why this may be or appears to be growing in relevance as we think about carbon stocks and carbon accounting. And then Sarah Paradis will follow on to talk about how sedimentology and biogeochemical processes can be impacted by human activity, specifically bottom trawling on the sea floor. Next week, we will switch and have another presentation from the group here at ETH, Elena Bruni, and she will be talking about the role of sediment hydrodynamic properties in carbon cycling on the Namibian margin and elsewhere. And lastly, Kate French, who was an early participant in the RGNO, she's going to be giving some evidence from pigments for the presence of anoxygenic photosynthesis in the Benguela Upwelling System. Okay, so we'll start with my presentation then. And so we're going to be looking mostly at carbon stocks in marine sediments. And so I'll try and provide some context as to why this, I think, is an interesting topic, and also why it's of interest for the Namibian system. So these are some of the keywords that I gave to Kurt, and hopefully we will touch upon all of these: global biogeochemical cycles, carbon stocks, sediments, oceans, climate change, exclusive economic zones, and carbon inventories. Okay, so let's start with something which I think all of you should be very familiar with, but I just extracted this this past week, and this is the record of atmospheric CO2 concentrations at Mauna Loa on the island of Hawaii. And these have been measured since just before 1960. And what you can see here is this very steady increase in atmospheric CO2 with the seasonal cycles of CO2 uptake and release superimposed on this, giving it this sawtooth pattern. So back in the early 1960s, the concentration of atmospheric CO2 was about 315 ppm. And at the present day, we're up at now, as of last April 22nd, 418 ppm. And what you can hopefully see from these lines is they're sort of gradually getting further and further apart, which shows that this is not a linear increase, that is increasing more and more as we move towards the future. So, of course, this is of broad international global concern. This is something a little bit also more topical, given what's happened over the past year. This is from the Global Carbon Cycle, Global Carbon Project. And so here's the reference here. And here, what it shows you is the emissions of fossil fuel CO2 and how they have increased since 1990, in this case, up to 2020. And what you can see here is this decrease in emissions, which is about a 7% decrease relative to the preceding years. And this is directly related to COVID and its impact on the global economy. So clearly there's an impact of this pandemic, but this is not to say that emissions are not still increasing, and as we saw from the previous slide, that in fact the concentrations are still going up. So this, of course, is all related to the carbon cycle, and this is just one rendition of the carbon cycle, where we think of it in terms of its natural processes and the ones that we can observe and measure in terms of terrestrial photosynthesis and marine photosynthesis, creating fixed reduced carbon from atmospheric CO2, and then it's going through these various processes of humification in soils and also through the oceanic biological pump, sinking and either remineralization in the deep ocean or burial in underlying sediments, which ultimately can be converted to sedimentary rocks. And over geologic time, these can be uplifted, eroded, reintroducing CO2 back to the atmosphere. And of course, as humans, then we are essentially bypassing a couple of these vectors through fossil fuel utilization and land use change, but particularly fossil fuel utilization is the dominant source of the increase in atmospheric CO2 induced by anthropogenic activity. So this is what so much attention is being paid to, how large these emissions are. And again, going back to this global carbon project, they have some very nice sort of synthesis figures here, looking, for instance, at the change in the global carbon cycle caused by anthropogenic activities, looking just in this case over the last decade. And they have numbers here of uptake of CO2 by the ocean. They also have the emissions of fossil fuel, land use change, uptake by the terrestrial biosphere. And then the size of the circles here are the relative sizes of the carbon stocks. So as the global population and individual nations are trying to look at these emissions, much of the focus has been on trying to look at the ability of the terrestrial biosphere both to take up carbon, but also potentially to release it through destabilization of soil carbon. So the process of accounting or stock taking of carbon at a national level has received a lot of interest from this perspective of soils and vegetation on the terrestrial biosphere. And what I want to do today is to go into the marine environment and ask the question, should we be thinking about this also from the context of carbon stocks held within marine sediments? So if we look at the global ocean, and this is a recent paper that came out that uses machine learning techniques to extrapolate from point source data to derive a high resolution, high spatial resolution global map of organic carbon contents of ocean sediments, and then calculate what the inventory of that organic carbon is for the entire ocean sediment region, in this case for the top 1 meter of sediment. And they calculate here that there's about 3,000 petagrams of organic carbon in this top 1 meter of sediment. But also what you can see here is the vast amount of this sediment or this organic carbon, as highlighted by the brown colors, is residing around the continental margins, as you can see here. And the open oceans are actually very, very low in organic carbon stocks. So all the carbon is being held on the continental margins. And those continental margins, of course, are extremely diverse in their characteristics, depending on whether you're at high latitudes or low latitudes. So whether you're in the Arctic, where there's a lot of carbon stored in permafrosts and even subsea permafrost, previously glaciated environments where you have fjord systems, moving through to temperate and tropical regions where you can have extensive river deltas, and then in the tropics, mangrove systems and wetlands, and also anoxic basins. And then out on the margins themselves, of course, we have various contrasts in depositional and productivity characteristics, with some areas such as, of course, off Namibia, where you have this pronounced oxygen deficiency due to local upwelling and very high primary productivity that causes this oxygen drawdown. So continental margins are where all the carbon is being buried, but continental margins are spatially very heterogeneous. So this is where we started to begin to ask this question about, well, are carbon stocks in marine sediments of any significance if you think of them at a national level? So here we have a sort of a schematic of some aspects of the carbon cycle for a coastal or maritime nation. So here is the land and here is the ocean. And we've sort of indicated where the exclusive economic zone would be for that nation, with the 200 nautical miles from the coast. And of course, there would be some national internal boundary as well relative to the neighboring country. So the soils and vegetation within this national boundary, this is where carbon stock taking is currently underway as a way of assessing the extent to which nations are net sources or sinks of CO2 to the atmosphere. But then the question is, well, how about the carbon that's residing in marine sediments within this exclusive economic zone? And actually this question, I first had this question having come to an RGO in Namibia. And Namibia, to me, really drives home the contrast between clearly you have an extremely productive coastal environment, sustaining very productive fisheries, and also having very high organic carbon contents of the underlying sediments. Whereas in contrast on land, much of Namibia, of course, is arid and does not support a lot of vegetation and therefore does not have large soil carbon stocks. So as a sort of a thought exercise, we thought, well, it'd be interesting to compare the amount of carbon residing within the exclusive economic zone of Namibia with that of its soil. And we chose a couple of other locations that vary in the proportions of area of land to EEZ. So here is Pakistan, and then here is the United Kingdom, which is an island nation, so it has a large EEZ. So part of the reason we chose Namibia is there has been so much work that has been done here, primarily through German research over many, many decades, such that these beautiful maps of organic carbon content of sediments have previously been generated. And this is from Mike Inthorn's paper in 2006. And this shows sort of the coverage that we're looking at here. So we use this as a starting point because there's so much information to try and estimate what amount of carbon might be residing within the EEZ of Namibia, and then to compare it to what we could find for soil carbon stocks, which actually the amount of data is very, very minimal in that particular case. But just as a first look then, here is the amount of area of EEZ versus land surface for Namibia, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. So you can see that Pakistan has the most land relative to EEZ. The United Kingdom is the opposite, and Namibia is somewhere in between. And then this is the approximated carbon stocks held within the marine sediments of the EEZ, so that within the soils. And here you can see that Namibia has approximately twice as much carbon held within its EEZ sediments relative to its soils, compared to Pakistan, which is sort of the opposite, and then United Kingdom, despite the fact it being a temperate setting with very rich soils on land, because the EEZ is so extensive, then this number is also quite large. So from these numbers then, one would begin to think that this might be something that at least should be considered as we explore the carbon inventories on a national level, and also how those carbon inventories may be changing in the face of climate change and related anthropogenic change. And so this map just gives an indication of other nations with their fractions of EEZ relative to their total area. And so the dark blues are areas where, particularly where there is a large fraction of the EEZ relative to the land area, and where these marine sediment carbon stocks may be important. And this has gathered a lot of attention and is garnering more and more attention from those who are much better equipped to actually discuss the sort of the legalese and all the bureaucratic vehicles that are required to implement something like this. And this was an interesting recent paper by Luisetti et al., which talks about the fact that also when we're looking at carbon stocks within a nation, because oceans are surrounding all the different continents and there are currents driving water and sediment around, one person's carbon that is deposited in one nation can certainly potentially be laterally transported across a national boundary and deposited in somebody else's backyard. So there's many complexities to this that are too difficult to go into now, and I won't dwell on those, but it just is to make the point that this is certainly a complex issue, and I'm not sure we have a good solution for it yet. But the second theme that I want to drive home today is, although I was just talking about carbon stocks, how much carbon is being buried and stored within ocean sediments, it is also, if you like, the flavor of that carbon that is equally important if we want to understand its role and its exchange with the atmosphere. So this is from a nice review paper by Sandra Arndt, where she highlights some of the range of processes over continental margins, particularly the notion that you have processes of sediment erosion and deposition. And Elena Bruni will be talking a lot about that, the natural processes next week. Sarah will be following on with discussing this shortly from an anthropogenic standpoint. But many of these processes involve transport, and also they involve decomposition of material, and that degradation often has aging associated with it. So both through settling through the water column, but also in lateral processes as well. So when we think about the carbon that is being deposited, it's not only how much it is, it's also what its previous history has been and what that might mean in terms of its reactivity. And again, this is also from the same paper by Sandra Arndt, a very nice review paper where she shows for different locations, ocean regions, changes in the apparent degradation rate constant. So this is reactivity, if you like, of the organic matter as a function of these different environments. And this is a log scale, and you can see that there's huge variability across these regions, although there are some general trends. And the other point I want to draw here is that to some extent, this variability is mirrored by the age of this organic matter. And this is expressed here as FM for the fraction modern in terms of radiocarbon content. So young versus old carbon. So you can see that there's again considerable variability, with this being modern carbon and 0 being more than 50,000 radiocarbon years old. So this age reactivity is an important consideration if we want to think about how stable the carbon is that is residing in marine sediments, how prone it is to remineralization. So in part driven by these sorts of questions, we have been embarking over the last, well, almost since I started at Woods Hole, at ETH, creating a database driven primarily by radiocarbon. We call it Mosaic. I'll mention it again a little bit later on. But this is a database of surface sediment, carbon content, radiocarbon age, and related properties. And so this is not up to date, but it gives an indication of the range of different locations where we have been accumulating data. And I want to highlight just here again this plot of radiocarbon age of bulk organic carbon in surface sediments. This is the upper 1 to 2 centimeters as a function of water depth of those sediments. So if you like, we're going from shallow continental shelf seas here all the way down into the deep ocean at 5 kilometers water depth, surface sediments in each case. And again, this is showing values in FM from old to young. And you see this huge variation in age, which therefore must also to some degree reflect variations in reactivity. And in particular, what you see is that continental shelf settings, where the water depths are just a few hundred meters deep, have an enormous variation in their radiocarbon content or age due to a complex variety of different processes. We're just going to go quickly to one region where we have been investing the most time so far, which is the Chinese marginal seas. And this is one where we have made a lot of core top radiocarbon measurements. So here's the Yangtze River. So Shanghai would be here. The Yellow River is here, and Beijing would be somewhere over here. And this is the Bohai Sea, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, going through to the South China Sea. And these show all the locations of sediment cores, and the size of the symbol is the water depth to give you a sense of increasing water depth. And here is the bulk C14 content, this now shown as delta 14C, but it's a similar thing where you have very negative values being old or positive values being younger. And this is varying from close to modern C14 content all the way down to very close to infinite in C14 age, so over 10,000 radiocarbon years. And it shows you for this region, there is tremendous heterogeneity in the age of the organic carbon that is deposited in this very heterogeneous and dynamic marginal sea system, partially driven by old carbon coming in from the rivers, but also partially driven by sediment redistribution processes. And we can also see this variability, for instance, in the stable carbon isotopes, which again is related to the sources of carbon coming in from the rivers, being terrestrial plant derived and more depleted in C13 relative to marine carbon. But it is also related to the processing of that organic matter once it is deposited in this shallow shelf sea environment. And last of all, there are also relationships to grain size here, with finer grains in reds and yellows mapping onto some of the areas where you have higher C14, but also following this sort of plume of gray values down here, hugging the coast of China. This is where one of the coastal currents takes the Yangtze River plume and transports it down towards the south. So you can see here, these are very, very complex, spatially heterogeneous systems. And if we want to do proper carbon accounting and understanding also the reactivity of this material, we cannot simply just take this shelf sea system and measure how much carbon is there and use this as an assessment of its vulnerability, if you like, to release. So we've also been therefore developing methods using things like carbon content, C14 age, grain size, to develop clustering approaches where we can subdivide this marginal sea system according to these different properties, and that this would then provide a better framework for, on a sub-region basis, doing this carbon accounting. And so this notion then of radiocarbon age variability as a proxy, if you like, for reactivity of the organic matter is something that we are extending around different ocean systems. You can see we've moved from the eastern Chinese marginal seas now into the southern South China Sea region. And we've been doing this in other parts of the world's oceans. And I won't show you Namibia because Eleanor Bruni has been working on that specific area for her PhD thesis, and she'll be describing that next week. But you can see the approach that we're trying to take here. So when it comes back to this figure that I showed you at the beginning, where we have these different lenses by which we can look at sediments in terms of paleoceanography, biogeochemistry, organic geochemistry, and ecology, I think we might also want to add an extra lens to this view to think about what this might mean in terms of carbon accounting, and what this means in terms of both the inventory of carbon that's held across a certain depth range, but also taking into account its reactivity. I see this as a very important additional consideration. And this is very much the same as how soil carbon is explored in terms of different pools of different reactivity and different vulnerability to climate change or anthropogenic perturbation. So all this then points towards how these carbon stocks may change in the future. And there's a very nice review paper by Rick Kyle, which brings up these different topics in terms of changes in, of course, ocean acidification, deoxygenation, stratification, and also direct perturbations such as bottom trawling that Sarah will be describing in the next presentation. And I just want to finish by taking you back to Mosaic. This is now online, and this will be a growing database. In fact, Sarah has just embarked on her postdoctoral studies focusing on expansion and utilization of this database. And so we're very keen to bring more and more data into it to make it more and more useful. And so for those of you here who may have data to contribute, please get in touch or check out the website, and we'll be happy to talk with you further about this. Okay, so with that, I'd just like to thank a lot of people who've been involved in various aspects of this study, from the Mosaic database through to the results I showed you from the Chinese marginal seas, and also to those who've made all of the measurements that I showed you possible. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for a very interesting and comprehensive talk about the carbon cycle. We still take a few minutes for discussion. Is anybody who would like address the question to Tim? We would like to have an increase in stock now in order to reduce the carbon from the atmosphere, transform it into organic, and then put it into a sink in the ocean. So what works against that is the degradation. Now, from some of your graphs, I conclude that there are kind of organic molecules that are less degradable. So what would you project as a long-term storage for carbon? Where and under what conditions?
Yes, so it's, well, I think that you can also ask the question, is it good to store a lot of carbon in ocean sediments? I was describing them in terms of carbon stocks and carbon sinks. So from that perspective, it is good, but often those conditions that you are, that are conducive to preservation of organic carbon are also ones that aren't necessarily ideal in terms of promoting biodiversity and full sort of trophic level ecosystems. So of course, when you have very, very low oxygen conditions, as you do on Namibia, then this drives the ecosystem towards, at least in the sediments, predominantly microbially dominated systems. And there's a lot of concerns about ocean deoxygenation, so expansion of low oxygen zones, which is seen as, in some respects, as a negative consequence of ongoing changes. So you could lower oxygen and you could promote carbon preservation. You could add more refractory carbon to the sea floor, and again, you can think of this in terms of, well, there's many discussions about ongoing fate of microplastics, so a very human form of refractory carbon, and so this has a high preservation potential, but I don't think we want to have a ocean floor full of plastics either. Then there is the notion that terrestrial carbon tends to be more refractory than marine carbon, largely because it's has high abundances of structural polymers, which are slower to decompose. And so addition of refractory terrestrial materials would be another way of promoting this. But I'm not sure we in general are, it's really a question that's out there as to whether or not we would want to enhance our marine carbon stocks, or rather just make sure that they don't change in the other direction.
Yeah, that's certainly one point, but it has happened in Earth's history again and again. Coal, oil, etc., are nothing but carbon sinks. And so are we going in that direction, or is that not an option to make more sink carbon?
Well, yeah, so those periods of geologic time that gave rise to these large reserves of petroleum are often coincident with times when the ocean was warm and it was stratified and low in oxygen, and so carbon preservation was enhanced. So we may be moving towards an ocean that looks a bit more like that, yes.
Okay, are there other questions?
So my question is, so the surface really carbon has a very big range. It seems like the deep ocean has a very narrow range, and it's not biased to the old age. So do you think it's because the old refractory carbon are permanently stored on the shelf and upper slope, they do not get into the ocean, or somehow they actually oxidize in the way moving down to the deep ocean?
So I think the answer to that is probably yes to both of those explanations. So yes, so I think the coastal ocean is the place where fossil carbon or aged carbon is entering from the continents. So you have localized sources of very old carbon. That's one aspect. Whereas in the deep ocean, of course, you're very remote from these terrestrial influences. And so you're largely dominated by marine productivity, although only a very, very small fraction of that is ultimately sequestered in these deep ocean sediments. So that's part of it. But also the coastal oceans are, they're in general, bottom currents are stronger, more dynamic. And so there's very potential for extensive sediment redistribution and both decomposition and aging of organic matter associated with these sediment redistribution processes. And we see good evidence of this on over the Namibian margin, and the few other places where we've tried to look at this, you can see this aging process taking place. But the last is that, yes, material that is leaving the shelf and upper slope and making its way down to the deep ocean basins, often they're exposed to they have prolonged exposure to oxygen or to oxic decomposition. And this gradually chews away at pretty much anything that's there, even material that's closely associated with minerals. And so that the proportion of this material that makes its way out into the deep ocean is very, very limited. And therefore it is this small leakage of material by the biological pump from the surface ocean that is predominating there. So I think this is the reason why you see a much narrower range within these quiescent deep ocean basins, well far removed from continental margins, with these very localized point sources of old carbon coming in from rivers, but also very dynamic coastal current systems that can move this material around over long periods of time and over large distances.
Okay, thank you, Tim.